Cold rain veiled the skyline, streaking against the mirrored walls of the Hangang Art Exchange. Inside, beneath chandeliers the color of old ivory, the elite of Asia's corporate world gathered for an exclusive charity auction. It was the kind of night where power whispered behind champagne glasses, and every smile hid a transaction. Near the entrance, a crystal goblet rested on a marble counter, its wine so dark it looked like a drop of night itself. Chairman Min Jae-sung, CEO of Draven Corp., arrived alone. The crowd parted as if instinctively fearing him. Cameras flashed. His expression never changed. To mortals, he was an enigma, a ruthless young tycoon, rumored to never appear in daylight. To the few who knew the truth, he was the last heir of an ancient vampire bloodline that had quietly survived into the age of technology. Tonight, he came not for art or charity, but to control a relic that could expose his kind to the modern world. Among the museum staff was Elena Cole, a quiet, meticulous art consultant from New York, recently hired to verify the authenticity of medieval artifacts. Her contract was temporary, her debts were not. She had no reason to notice the man who owned half of Seoul's skyline until his shadow fell over her checklist. Their meeting began with an accident, a mislabeled item, an argument among assistants, and Elena stepping in to correct the error before it reached the auctioneer. Her calm precision caught Min's attention. For one brief second, he turned his gaze fully toward her and felt the echo of something he thought long gone, not thirst, recognition. Later, historians would describe that night as the moment when the vampire CEO's control faltered for the first time in 2 centuries. The cameras captured only a man and a woman exchanging polite words over a misplaced label. But behind that simple interaction, destiny stirred like an old hunger waking beneath the glass city lights. And when the first bell rang to signal the opening of bids, the crystal goblet trembled slightly on the counter, just enough to spill a drop of dark wine, as if marking the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. The auction hall was a cathedral of wealth, marble floors reflecting chandeliers, servers gliding like ghosts between rows of silk gowns and sharp suits. Every whisper carried a calculation. Dravencorp's logo shimmered across banners, its influence stretching far beyond finance, biotech, defense, even synthetic blood research under humanitarian pretexts. And at its throne sat Min Jae-sung, a man who had perfected the art of existing among humans without ever being one of them. To his board, he was a prodigy turned myth. To rival corporations, a monster wearing charm like armor. None suspected that the rumors were almost true, that his aversion to sunlight, his flawless composure, his nocturnal schedule, all served to disguise what he truly was. His kind had survived by evolving. No coffins, no capes, only contracts and silence. The modern world's addiction to screens kept them invisible. Min's curse was not hunger, it was isolation. The older he grew, the more distant life appeared, like a film he could no longer touch. For decades, he had lived on discipline and imitation. The glass goblet of red wine at every public event was a symbol of control, appearance without indulgence. But control had a cost. Thirst, suppressed too long, began to translate into restlessness, into the ache of meaning unfulfilled. Across the room, Elena reviewed provenance sheets beside other curators. She was not impressed by wealth or myth. What struck her was the weight of objects, the way history could lie elegantly. She had spent her life studying stories carved in stone, but never one like the man who stood under that spotlight. Her father's illness had taught her that control could become cruelty when it denied emotion. That memory made her notice Min's restraint, his measured tone, the way he avoided brushing anyone's hand. As the evening advanced, a particular lot drew attention. Lot 57, an iron reliquary, believed to contain a thorn from St. Lucia's crown, a relic said to put immortals into a sleep resembling death. The rumor had reached Min's clan. If the artifact was real, it could neutralize his bloodline. If it fell into human hands, Centuries of secrecy could collapse overnight. And yet, standing at the edge of that glittering crowd, Min felt a different danger. He felt it in the moment his gaze found Elena again, when reason collided with recognition, and the wound beneath all his discipline whispered, "You are starving, not for blood, but for something human enough to hurt." The auction's rhythm pulsed like a heartbeat wrapped in silk murmurs, laughter, and the delicate clinking of glass. Beneath the surface of all that refinement, panic stirred quietly behind a curtained side hall. A shipment coordinator had mislabeled a crate. Lot 57, the reliquary, was placed under the wrong number. If exposed, the mix-up could embarrass both the museum and Dravencorp. The junior handler responsible stood pale and trembling, seconds from being dismissed in front of donors. Elena, who wasn't even assigned to that section, saw the commotion. She stepped forward, voice steady, clipboard firm, and took responsibility. "The mislabeling was mine," she said evenly, though it wasn't. "I corrected it already." Her tone was composed but protective, the kind that stopped cruelty mid-motion. The supervisor hesitated. The handler nearly cried, and the incident dissolved before it ever became gossip. From a distance, Min Jae-sung watched. He shouldn't have cared, but there was something about that gesture, the way she shielded someone weaker without hesitation, that broke through his practiced indifference. He had seen courage in battle, loyalty in blood pacts, but kindness? That was rarer. The simple humanity of it was disarming. For a creature who'd learned to survive through fear and negotiation, compassion felt like light through a crack he hadn't noticed before. Later, when Elena passed through the main hall again, she caught him watching her. It wasn't the look of a man assessing beauty. It was the quiet, startled gaze of someone remembering hunger. Theirs was not yet attraction, but recognition. Two disciplined lives, briefly intersecting in the language of restraint. Min approached her under the pretext of professionalism. His voice was low, the kind designed to remain unheard by microphones. "Your intervention prevented a scandal," he said. "That employee will keep his job. You value loyalty." "I value fairness," she replied, meeting his eyes without fear. "Museums should protect truth, not reputations." He almost smiled, almost. "Truth," he repeated, as though tasting a forgotten word. Behind them, waiters refilled glasses. The scent of red wine drifted through the air, sweet and metallic. Min turned slightly away from it. Elena noticed. It was subtle, but she had studied human behavior too long not to recognize avoidance. She assumed it was allergy, fatigue, perhaps the boredom of the wealthy. Still, her curiosity flickered. There was something about the way he moved too precise, too careful, like a dancer concealing an injury. That night, long after guests left and the city drowned in fog, Min stood alone by the exhibition window, watching her reflection fade into glass. The sound of her voice lingered in his mind, not her words, but her tone. It had been years since he'd heard anyone speak to him without fear or agenda. He could still smell the trace of her perfume, lavender and old paper, and feel the pulse that had quickened when she'd looked directly at him. For the first time in a century, he realized how profoundly silence could ache. In the record books, nothing notable happened between the CEO and the consultant that night. But the security footage told a quieter truth. The immortal paused beside a human woman, said a few words, and forgot to breathe for an entire 7 seconds, long enough for even the cameras to wonder what had changed. And above them, the crystal goblet that had spilled earlier still rested on its marble pedestal, one drop of dried wine tracing a crimson path down its stem, like the start of a story that hadn't yet decided whether it would end in ruin or redemption. Min Jae-sung's penthouse sat high above the Han River, where the city blurred into a galaxy of lights reflected on glass. From this height, even the moon looked artificial. It was his sanctuary and his prison, a climate-controlled space where time could not touch him, and where silence pressed harder than sound. He stood before a wall of screens showing financial updates, biotech patents, and surveillance footage from the auction hall below. He had learned to live this way, detached, analytical, efficient. Each decision had consequence measured in lives, in markets, in whispers among clans that had gone corporate. He ruled not a kingdom of shadows, but of shareholders. Yet his reflection in the window revealed the same curse that ruled every era: the thirst. Synthetic blood had made immortality manageable. No need for hunting, no stains to hide. But it was an empty nourishment. It dulled instinct, but never silenced it. Centuries of control had turned his hunger into something more complex, a craving for warmth, for the pulse that no chemical formula could replicate. That was the wound he never named. And tonight, it stirred again. He replayed the footage of the auction corridor, the moment Elena had shielded that trembling employee. The way she placed herself between authority and vulnerability reminded him of someone long buried in memory, a mortal healer who once tended his wounds during the Japanese occupation. She, too, had defied hierarchy with quiet dignity. It had been her compassion, not her blood, that he remembered. And now, history seemed to echo through a stranger's face. Min turned off the screens and approached the table where the documents for Lot 57 lay waiting, the iron reliquary. He had confirmed the rumor. The artifact contained traces of blessed metal, deadly to his kind if misused. His rival, Chairman Yu of Songjin Group, had already signaled interest in acquiring it. To let it fall into human hands would risk exposure. To claim it himself would raise suspicion. Either way, it threatened the fragile coexistence between the old and the living. The board demanded he make an appearance with a fiancée, a facade of stability for investors. The clan elders whispered of alliances sealed by blood. But all Min could think of was the consultant who had spoken to him as though he were merely human. In her gaze, there had been no awe, no fear, just attentiveness, like she was reading a story she intended to understand completely. That kind of attention was dangerous. It unraveled disguises faster than sunlight. Min poured a glass of synthetic wine, the liquid reflecting his face like diluted dusk. He raised it but didn't drink. "Thirst," he murmured in Korean, "is not always for blood." The words fogged the glass as he exhaled, then vanished. Below, the city throbbed with mortal life, honking cars, late-night street food, laughter from riverbanks. He envied them. Mortals bled easily, but they also healed easily. Vampires simply endured. Immortality had preserved his empire, but robbed him of immediacy, of every reason hearts beat faster. He looked once more at the name printed on the incident report from earlier, Elena Cole. Next to it, her signature deliberate, elegant, precise. He traced it with one gloved finger, memorizing the curve of each letter as if it were a lifeline. Somewhere deep within, a decision began to form, not yet spoken, not yet rational, only a whisper of instinct. If this woman could move without fear in his presence, perhaps she could stand beside him in the light of scandal, not as prey, not as pawn, but as something dangerously closer to equal. Outside, dawn's first gray hint brushed the horizon, and Min turned away before it could reach him. The glass of synthetic wine remained untouched on the table, its surface trembling faintly, as though waiting for the moment when his thirst would finally admit its true name. The next evening, the Hanggang Art Exchange glittered once again, this time quieter. The pre-auction review closed to the public, reserved only for executives and experts. The air smelled of polish, ink, and the faint chill of metal relics. In that sterile calm, Elena worked under the soft hum of halogen lamps, cataloging final details for the display of Lot 57. She didn't hear Min Jae-sung approach until his reflection appeared beside hers on the glass case. He stood with hands behind his back, the embodiment of composed authority. Yet there was an undercurrent in his voice, something measured, cautious, as though he were testing the distance between formality and curiosity. "Your report on the reliquary," he said, "was thorough. You caught a detail our historians missed." Elena glanced up, surprised but professional. "The metal's composition doesn't match the stated century. It's later 15th, not 13th. The carving technique gave it away. Impressive, he murmured, studying the artifact, but not its reflection hers. You notice what others overlook. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was observant. There, under white light, they both became still, the immortal and the mortal, drawn into the same focus. Elena returned to her notes. Min remained at her side, offering corrections only when necessary. Their collaboration became an unspoken rhythm. She adjusted the lighting, he adjusted the temperature controls, so she wouldn't shiver. It was subtle, invisible courtesy, the kind that could only exist between two people fluent in restraint. When the curator requested a verification photo for the auction's press release, Min unexpectedly stepped into frame beside her. The photographer fussed with angles, asking for proximity to fit both within the shot. Min moved slightly closer, a whisper of distance, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. He felt the warmth of her skin, the heartbeat beneath, and something ancient within him recoiled and reached at once. Elena, aware of his hesitation, met his gaze with quiet steadiness. If you're uncomfortable, I'm not, he interrupted softly. Just out of practice. The flash went off, freezing them in a perfect tableau, two professionals appearing composed. But beneath that stillness, tension hummed like a violin string drawn too tight. The photo would later circulate through the board's channels, sparking rumors neither of them anticipated. After the photographer left, Elena leaned slightly toward the artifact again. There's something else, she said. The reliquary wasn't meant to be opened. Its lock was designed for containment, not access. Whatever's inside was supposed to stay sealed. Min's voice lowered. You're certain? Yes. If someone tries to force it, the metal will splinter. Her certainty struck him like sunlight through fog, not because of the discovery, but because of her fearlessness in speaking it to power. Few mortals ever corrected him. None had done it so calmly. He studied her profile, the concentration in her brow, the faint reflection of lamplight in her eyes. There was no hunger now, not in the way he had known it. What he felt instead was the ache of proximity, of something alive, daring to stand so close without trembling. It wasn't the pulse he wanted to touch, but the courage behind it. Elena finally looked at him, sensing his stillness. You don't seem like a man who trusts easily, she said. I don't, he replied. But tonight, I almost do. The words hung between them, honest and dangerous. When she left, he remained alone in the sterile hall, staring at the reflection they had shared on the glass. For the first time in decades, he felt his control slipping, not to hunger, but to possibility. Outside, the river wind howled softly through the night, and the crystal goblet on his office table quivered again, catching moonlight like a pulse reborn. The following night brought the winter auction gala, a spectacle of velvet, flashbulbs, and unspoken rivalries. Beneath chandeliers dripping with glass like frozen rain, Seoul's elite gathered to witness history sold to the highest bidder. Reporters buzzed like insects, and whispers of Chairman Min's mystery fiancée had already spread through every corridor before he even arrived. Elena, unaware of the storm forming above her name, stood backstage, reviewing the final catalog, when her phone vibrated with a message marked Dravencorp Private Line. Miss Cole, I need a word. It's urgent. Minutes later, she found herself in a secluded corridor lined with portraits of forgotten donors. Min Jae-song waited there, immaculate, in a dark tailored suit, black tie, knotted with mathematical precision. His eyes, however, carried none of that calm. Elena, he began, his voice low, as if every syllable could bruise the air. I'm asking something I shouldn't. She hesitated, reading tension in his posture. What happened? My rival arrived early with a guest who plans to expose internal affairs. If the board senses weakness, the auction will turn into a feeding ground. She frowned. And what do you need from me? He exhaled through his nose, a slow, restrained breath. I need you to pretend to be my fiancé. The words hung between them, impossible, yet undeniable. Elena blinked, trying to determine if he was joking. He wasn't. His tone held no arrogance, only sincerity, edged with urgency. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted. "They're already circling. It's not about me. If they connect you to the reliquary discovery, you'll be targeted professionally and otherwise. Standing beside me protects you, but it will also expose you." Her heart pounded. "Expose me how?" "They'll tear through your life looking for scandal. You'll be dissected by people who think cruelty is currency." He paused, his eyes flicking to her lips and back with controlled precision. "I'll understand if you say no." Elena stared at him for a long moment, mind racing. Every instinct told her to walk away, to avoid becoming another pawn in the politics of men with power. But she remembered the way he'd looked at her yesterday, not as property, but as something he couldn't quite categorize. And despite herself, she trusted that. "I'll do it," she said softly, "but on one condition." "Name it." "I won't lie about my job, and I won't be touched for show." Something flickered in his eyes, not annoyance, but admiration. "Agreed," he said. Then, with deliberate slowness, he extended his hand. "Shall we make them believe?" When her fingers met his, a pulse of warmth spread through him so sudden it almost broke his composure. For centuries, his touch had drawn fear, or worship, never calmness. Her heartbeat echoed through that contact like a metronome, reminding him of the world's tempo. He wanted to release her immediately, but couldn't. They entered the ballroom together, hand in hand. The crowd stilled. Cameras erupted. The rival chairman froze mid-conversation. Every glance became a blade of speculation. Elena, under the blaze of flashlights, kept her spine straight, her gaze steady. Min felt the old instinct rise, protective, possessive, perilous, and crushed it beneath discipline. He leaned toward her only once during the opening speech, just enough for the cameras to capture the whisper. "You're trembling." "I'm human," she murmured. "You should try it sometime." He nearly smiled. Nearly. That night, the city's social feeds exploded with their image, the untouchable CEO and his mysterious fiancée. But what the headlines missed was the tremor in his hand when he let hers go, and the way his eyes lingered on the pulse at her wrist, not out of hunger, but reverence. It was then that Min understood the true danger. The lie he had created to protect her was already starting to feel truer than anything he'd lived in centuries. The moment they stepped into the ballroom together, the air shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Curiosity sharpened into calculation. Every gaze measured the fiancée of Dravencorp's elusive CEO, her posture, her accent, the simplicity of her gown. In a world where perfection was manufactured, Elena Cole's sincerity felt like a flaw, and that made it dangerous. Chairman Yu, Min's rival, watched from across the room with a glass of scotch and a smile that never touched his eyes. "The American consultant?" he murmured to his aide. "Interesting choice. Either he's desperate, or she's bait." Within minutes, whispers coiled through the crowd like smoke. "She's a museum hire. She's a cover. She's his blood source." The board members of Dravencorp weren't far behind. They gathered near the champagne tower, murmuring in low, anxious tones. "He's jeopardizing investor trust," one said. "We asked for stability, not scandal," another added. "If she speaks out of turn, we could lose billions." Min Jae-sung heard them all. His senses caught every heartbeat, every mutter, every judgment. He stood tall beside Elena, expression calm, but his gaze flickered with restrained fury. Her presence wasn't weakness. It was defiance, a reminder that his authority was his alone to command. Yet even he could feel the tightening noose of social expectation. The auction prince now had a bride. The narrative was out of his control. Elena, sensing the tension, leaned slightly closer, whispering without looking at him. "You don't have to protect me from gossip. I've survived worse." Her tone steadied him. "This isn't gossip," he replied quietly. "It's war, with better lighting." The auction resumed. As bids escalated, the rival chairman smirked across the room. deliberately raising his paddle each time Min joined in. The crowd watched two empires clash with elegant smiles. But behind that civilized duel, darker forces stirred an old clan rival who wanted the reliquary not for history, but for blood. When the bidding ended, Min had outmaneuvered his rival with calculated precision. Yet, victory tasted hollow. Around them, the court of high society began its slow retaliation, subtle questions, veiled insults, political ambushes, masked as compliments. Elena endured them all with quiet grace, her poise unnerving the very people who sought to diminish her. And as Min escorted her out beneath the chandelier's dying light, he realized that the human he had chosen for a facade had already begun to alter the room's balance of power, not through fear, but through dignity. A force his immortal world had long forgotten how to handle. The night's glamour dissolved into tension as the auction neared its climax. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The reliquary, Lot 57, rested under a spotlight like a captured secret. Every bidder knew it was valuable, but only Min Jae-sung understood what it could do. Inside that iron box, blessed metal could paralyze his kind for centuries. To lose it was risk. To win it publicly was exposure. The rival chairman, Yu, leaned back in his seat, lifting his paddle lazily. His smirk was calculated to provoke. "1 billion won," he called out. The crowd gasped. Elena felt Min tense beside her, only a flicker, but enough to betray his unease. She knew the reliquary mattered, though not why. Still, instinct told her this was no longer about art. When the bid reached absurd heights, Elena leaned toward him. "Walk away," she whispered. "There's something you're not telling me, but whatever that is, it's not worth this." He met her eyes, steady, conflicted, haunted. If he takes it, people will die. The words chilled her. She didn't need the full truth to recognize the weight behind them. "Then there's another way," she said quickly, flipping open her notebook. "The item's unstable. Look, its internal lock shows stress fractures. If you expose that to the board, the auctioneer will be forced to withdraw it. No one can buy what's been deemed unsafe." Her logic was clean, ruthless, and moral qualities Min had buried long ago. He glanced at her, and for the first time, followed someone else's lead. Moments later, the auctioneer's voice cracked over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received an urgent notice from the Conservation Board. Lot 57 has been removed from sale, pending further verification." A wave of confusion swept through the hall. The rival slammed his paddle down in fury, and photographers surged forward, hungry for scandal. But Min stayed silent. His empire might take a blow, yet what he felt was release. The ancient object would remain sealed. His people would remain hidden. Elena sat motionless. Realizing what she'd just done, she'd changed the course of a world she didn't even know existed. The cameras turned toward them. To the public, it looked like a CEO gracefully yielding a victory. But behind his stillness, Min felt something unfamiliar: humility. A human had saved him not from death, but from himself. When the auction lights dimmed, he leaned close enough for her to hear what no one else could. "You did more than protect me," he whispered. "You reminded me what it means to choose mercy over power." And though she didn't understand yet, she felt the tremor in his voice, the sound of an immortal realizing that salvation might come not through blood, but through a mortal's conscience. By the time the crowd dispersed, the story had already escaped their control. Social feeds flooded with headlines. "Vampire CEO's Fiancée saves auction scandal. Dravencorp chairman withdraws billion-won bid in act of integrity." The world called it strategy. For Min Jae-sung, it felt like confession. As dawn neared, he stood on the auction stage beside Elena, both under the glare of press lights. A journalist shouted, "Chairman Min, is it true your fiancée discovered the flaw?" Min didn't hesitate. "It's true," he said simply. "Her expertise preserved the museum's integrity. The credit is hers." The hall erupted in murmurs. No CEO in that world shared credit, least of all Min. Yet he did, publicly, irrevocably. The gesture traveled faster than rumor. It became narrative. Investors who doubted him now praised his transparency. The board, cornered by applause, followed his lead. The rival chairman's outburst earlier had been caught on camera, his arrogance exposed, his influence diminished. Elena remained still through it all, her hands clasped tightly, her heartbeat steady despite the cameras. She had not asked for this spotlight, yet she stood in it without shrinking. When Min looked at her, he saw not the mask of a fiancée, but the composure of a woman who had restored something sacred in a world that worshipped power. Later, in the quiet corridor behind the stage, she exhaled shakily. "You didn't have to mention my name," she said. "You'll have to explain that to your board." "I don't owe them explanations anymore," he replied. "Only truth." He turned toward her then, closer than before. The faint hum of electricity filled the silence. For a moment, the distance between predator and prey, master and mortal, CEO and consultant, collapsed. There was only two people standing in the aftermath of a choice that had rewritten both their fates. "You changed the narrative tonight," he said softly. "Not just theirs, mine." Elena smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," he answered, voice low. "That's why it matters." When they exited through the side doors, the first rays of dawn spread over the city like pale fire. Flashbulbs followed them, capturing the image of a man once feared and a woman once invisible walking side by side, unguarded, as if they shared not a secret, but a beginning. In that light, Min realized something more enduring than immortality itself, that power meant nothing unless it could bear the weight of sincerity. Seoul, 1 week later. The winter rain had returned, whispering against the glass walls of Dravencorp Tower. The frenzy had faded, replaced by a strange, calm reverence. Investors now spoke of ethical leadership. The board reluctantly praised Elena's discovery, and the press had turned her into a symbol of honesty in a world built on illusion. Yet inside his office, Min Jae-song dismissed the noise. The city could keep its praise. What mattered stood quietly before him, Elena, holding a familiar crystal goblet, now filled not with wine, but with steaming tea. "You never drink this," she said, setting it on his desk. "Maybe you should start." He studied the cup for a moment, the steam rising like fragile smoke between them. "Old habits die slower than we do," he said, half smiling. "I've noticed," she replied, eyes meeting his. "But some can change." They sat in silence, no masks, no contracts. The light of morning filtered through tinted glass, painting the room in muted gold. For the first time, Min didn't flinch from it. He realized he was no longer avoiding sunlight. He was learning to endure it. A soft knock interrupted them. A courier entered, delivering the restored reliquary now sealed, permanently, labeled, "Do not open, for study only." Elena smiled faintly. "Seems even legends can rest." "Perhaps they should," he murmured. When she rose to leave, Min stopped her with a quiet request. "Elena," he said, "stay a moment." She turned, waiting. "That night, when I asked you to pretend, it stopped being pretend," she finished gently. "For both of us." Her honesty struck deeper than any confession. He nodded once, unable to form words, and for a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, the immortal who had forgotten warmth, and the human who had returned it to him without meaning to. Outside, the storm lightened. The river shimmered with faint silver where clouds parted, and the city began to stir again. Elena placed her hand lightly over the goblet. "You kept this," she said. "It reminds me what not to spill," he answered. She smiled, and that was enough. In the centuries that followed, records of that auction would mention policies, reforms, mergers, but the archivists would always pause at one curious detail: the CEO who began drinking tea instead of wine, and the anonymous consultant whose signature appeared beside his on every document thereafter. And somewhere in Seoul, beneath the gray sky and neon rain, two lives continued, not as legend, not as lie, but as proof that even immortals can learn the taste of humanity, one quiet sip at a time.